like to clear up a few points. Sometimes when someone, let's say they follow things that I say, or let's say they even study destiny, a criticism or a fear or a projection, I mean, there's a lot of ways you can look at it, that people have about some of the things that I say, and I'll just speak for myself, is that in terms of the things that I say, it is somehow anti-God. Because I might say something like, God doesn't exist. Or I might say something like, I don't believe in God. And I might challenge somebody when I say, in the context of changing the system that we live in to be best for all, a belief in God tends to get in the way. Now, one of the things that I think it's easy to address, it's like an obvious point that where somebody's coming from, is let's say they are very strongly believing in God, maybe they go to church, it's a strong part of their identity, belief or faith in God or some religion, that when they hear those statements, it seems like perhaps I'm standing on the opposite side of like, there is no God, therefore I'm a Satan worshiper, or I worship the devil, or God equals good, therefore I stand for what is bad or evil. Of course, that's not at all the case, but I can see why someone would think that if in the context of the way they perceive God, there's either on one side God and on the other side evil or nothing or bad things. So you have to choose a side, basically. And if you're against the good / God side, then you must be on the side. You have to be on the side of evil, bad, no morality, no kindness, no compassion, not helping people. All of those things that you would consider good or moral. And so I wanted to kind of explore some of these concepts and just put it sort of on record, because I've never really done that before. Now, it's one thing when you're talking to somebody and you're saying something in a way to trigger something within them so that they will look at it. And in those moments, it's easy to take what was said and then take it out of context or not have all of the context. And therefore, it just seems like a singular statement. And then the person can add their own context to it, just like I'm saying. Against God, or even the idea of being against God, just because I might say God doesn't exist. And I want to make some statements, and you can kind of see where your mind goes with this. And let me just make the statements. So I'm giving you my perspective. God does not exist. God does exist. I don't believe in God. Also, let me rephrase that one. I don't believe God exists. Also, I don't believe God doesn't exist. These are all statements that I stand by. And it might seem initially like I'm just being funny or trying to be deliberately obscure or esoteric or something, and I'm not. I'm going to explain. Now, the one caveat I'll give is that I can't, and I'm not trying to convince somebody of something against their will, so to speak. Meaning, if there are just certain points that, let's say, I would consider illogical or not based in common sense, if there are certain points that I would consider not logical, and when I say logical, generally I mean common sense, because you can logically prove something that's clearly false just based on the assumptions of your logic. So logic is a tricky thing. And even within logic, it's been proven, I think I've done videos on this before, even within a logical system, there are things that can be true in the logical system that the logical system can't prove, and that's been proven with logic. So when I say logic, just generally realize if I'm saying something is logical, really what I mean is common sense. It's just even the word common sense, people have sort of a kind of a biased definition of that word. Like, it's not necessarily logical, although people do think it's also logical, but it's not purely logical. Okay, so common sense is just what is best. Okay, the common sense of something would be what is best. So when I say logical, I mean logic in that context. Okay, so let's say I'm talking about my perspective on God, and somebody just purely does not want to listen to common sense. They want to hold on to a belief that's purely not common sense, or what I would call irrational, illogical. Well, there's nothing that's going to convince that person because they've already made up their mind and they're not willing to change it. So I'm not trying to convince that person. I'm really speaking to the person who's like open and not totally set that what they believe is 100% infallible. So let's look at the point of God. Why do I say God exists and I say God doesn't exist? I was challenged one time because I was doing a speech, and in it I was suggesting that people, I don't have a problem personally with someone believing in God as long as they do not use it as an excuse to change the system to be what is best for everyone, to be best for all. And that would include at every level. And I was saying, Christians I find are particularly guilty, let's say, of this, of hiding behind God. New Age people just use the word love or energy. Other people in different faiths, religions, whatever, probably have some other word for it. But, I live in America, so there's a lot of Christians, and that's usually a big majority of who I interact with online, let's say. And it always comes down to, okay, we agree that, let's say, poverty is not a good thing. People are not having enough to eat. So let's change that. And they say, well, Christians want to change that too. Really? Okay, how? By giving food to the poor. And every week I give food to the charities, or I give money to the charities, or I give food to poor people. And I say, well, the system we live in actually creates poverty by design. That doesn't mean doesn't necessarily mean there's some grand conspiracy of people sitting around going, ooh, I want to create poverty. It's more of a consequence as to how the game is set up. Let me give you an example. Have you ever played Monopoly? Okay, if you haven't, I suggest to play it. When you start playing, the first person to really start getting an advantage on buying the right real estate will inevitably, generally speaking, win. And even if someone figures out a way to kind of get in there and do a different strategy and win, I think we can agree there's only one winner. You play the game until there's only one winner left. And that's how our economic system works. Although it's not necessarily only literally one person. Although if you were to play the whole economic system out over time, everyone who's really is playing to be the one winner. Although you could say there's just maybe one very small group of people who are the winner and everyone else loses. It's a zero-sum game. That's a fact. So the system by design has to create losers. And what we call poverty is just the extreme example of being on the losing side of the system, the economic system. So when I say it's by design, there's poverty, it's actually that way. It doesn't even matter if there's a certain person or group of people consciously doing it. It's just the way the system is designed and no one's changing it. So if you're a Christian and you're like, well, let's solve poverty, and I show you, hey, you have to actually change the system, and then you go to the next point of, well, only God can really cure poverty, and that's really God's point of, there's always going to be poverty, and ultimately He takes care. You see, like, it can be used as this, and I'm just giving you things that people say. It can be used as this excuse to like really just kind of be like, well, God, so I'll just do what I can, but I don't really have to take the responsibility of changing it for real. So I could probably talk for the next hour of just all the ways in which people use that concept of God as an excuse. Now, saying that, it may trigger a reaction in somebody of, oh, you're speaking negatively about God. Well, I'm not. I'm speaking about the person who is using that concept to, at the very least, allow a system that is evil, that is harmful, abusive. If some terrorist person blows up a building saying that they did it for God, you would, I'm sure, agree, that person is abusing the concept of God. So although this example of the person, saying we can't really change the system to end poverty because of some excuse of God being the ultimate power and really the ultimate point of taking responsibility, and you can't really do that because God has a plan, etc., etc., etc. It obviously doesn't seem as extreme an example of some terrorist act or something like that, but if you think about it, the system that you're holding in place through not being willing to stand up and change it because of a belief and an excuse based on that belief is, it really actually harms a lot more people at the end of the day. So let's just look at the point of God, for example. When I say God exists, God doesn't exist. What it comes down to, why it is used as an excuse, is the concept of God that also implies that this God is a higher power in the sense of there's this one singular power that is the highest power, and all things are less than, unequal to it, inferior to it in some way, less powerful. And there is this one singular point that is this higher power, highest power, in fact. So if you just look at that concept logically, if that point of highest power, higher power is focused in one individual being, and that being exists in the context of everything else that we know also exists, it creates automatically inequality. It creates automatically hierarchy. And let's just say, even for a moment, there's some validity to it. It doesn't really matter if there is, but I'm just saying, let's just pretend, okay, let's just not attack that particular point for a moment. What it does is allows humans to manipulate that concept of there's a higher power, there is a hierarchy, there is inequality in other humans, and then stand in a point of hierarchy in relation to those other humans. For example, kings is a perfect example. They even said, like, they're blessed by God, they are chosen by God, that God exists because they're the connection to God, they're the presence of God on earth, and some people might reject that, but that for many, many, many years, that was a concept that people went along with and gave kings and queens their sort of status and authority on earth over people. In today's world, people don't necessarily accept that in the same way, but we have religious leaders like the Pope and so forth, the Dalai Lama, you name it, pastors who kind of stand in that connection point where it's like, in a way, they stand in a hierarchy above other people. But the only reason they stand there is because there is a God, conceptually, who stands as the highest power. So it holds in the point of inequality inherently in our system, in our lives. Just the concept being accepted by people. So that's one problem with it. And that's really the major problem as to why you have to address this concept within yourself and really look at, okay, if I believe in a God, do I believe in a God as a higher power? Is it possible to have a concept of God where there doesn't therefore exist a being that is the higher/highest power? And if it is possible to believe, to have some recognition or belief in God, but it not necessarily be a singular being that represents the higher power, then, and therefore built-in inequality into our reality, and if it's possible to believe in such a God, then is anything that I'm saying inherently anti-God? So when I'm saying I don't believe in God, or I don't accept the idea of God and so forth, what I'm really saying is I don't accept the point of there being a higher power that therefore inherently structures into reality inequality. I do not accept that. And it's not a thing of I don't believe in it, I don't want to believe in it, it's I don't accept it. I don't accept that it is valid. I don't accept that it is true. I do not inherently accept that there is inequality, because if there is inherently inequality, then what are you saying? Some things are better than others? Is a rock better than a tree? Is a tree better than a telephone pole? Is a satellite better than a tomato? Is the president of France better than the poorest person in France? Is God better than you? Why would God create anything to be unequal to God? Is it not within the realm of possibility of God to create things that are equal to God? Or if not, that would be limiting God's power, God's ability. In fact, it would be limiting God if God created anything less than God. Because that would mean that what God creates is inherently less than God, instead of the most full expression of creation, which would be to create something equal to you, so that everything you create is equally valid, equally important, equally valuable. That would be the only real full expression of God, that when you create something that is equally valuable to you. Because if you're God, you're the best. So when you create, wouldn't it be a limitation of God to create things that are less than the best? Because if you're saying God creates things that are inherently unequal to it, him, her, whatever, you're saying God can't create the best. God can only create inferior products. Now you could say, well, God creates and then we have free choice and we choose to be inferior, but you're still allowing the possibility that we can be equal if that's your argument. If that we're inferior through choice, that's fine. I'm okay with that. But you would not then be allowed to, according to your own logic, hide behind the point of God is inherently the most highest power, period, and that has to be inherently built into the nature of reality. You would then be open to the point of, yes, there's a God that is the highest power currently, but that's simply because everything that God has created has not yet gone through the process of equalizing itself with God. And I'm okay with that to a certain degree, although there's still, I would say, some flaws in that. So I want to give you an alternative explanation of God that some little connection issues. So let me give you an alternative point about God. And you can kind of just play with it. You know, if you're still open to the idea of, okay, I want to believe in God, I don't want to use it as an excuse. And I'm open to the idea that maybe God is the best thing that exists, but there's no reason why everything can't be the best. Does that mean it would be equal to God, less than God? You're not really sure. And I want to show you that God, one thing people say about God is that ultimately as humans, we really can't comprehend the nature of God. It's ultimately incomprehensible, which is one of the excuses, I would say. There's probably a list of excuses. I'm sure we could make a list of all the excuses people use. So here's one of the excuses. Ultimately, God is incomprehensible. Well, I would suggest to you that if you really want to follow that point, the most incomprehensible thing you could probably understand, well, I guess you couldn't really understand it, but the most incomprehensible thing you could say about God is that God doesn't exist. For God to be ultimately incomprehensible to you, for God to exist would sort of be comprehensible. You'd have to be like, well, I mean, because if I said, no, God doesn't exist, and you're like, oh, that can't be true. So you're trying to apply some logic, some comprehensibility to it. So I want to suggest to you that both God exists and doesn't exist. And let's just go back to the beginning of time, okay? The beginning of creation. So probably as a Christian or someone who believes in God, you probably have some aspect within your belief that, in the beginning of reality, there was only God, okay? And nothing else existed. And at some point, God created something. Now, at that moment before God created anything, what else existed? Now, the common response I get is nothing. Okay, maybe that's the way I phrased it. Let me rephrase it. Before God created anything, what existed? You still might say nothing. I'm saying, well, did God exist? Yes. Okay, so before God created anything, what existed? Nothing. No. What existed? What was the only thing that existed? God. So before God created anything, what existed? Oh, God. Okay, God existed. Yes. Okay. So then when God created, what was the material, the substance, the thing that he created out of? You can't say nothing. You can't say, well, just God created out of nothing, because nothing didn't exist. God existed. You can't say nothing existed and God existed at the same time. So if God created, he had to create out of something. Couldn't create out of nothing. It's not possible. The only way for God to create out of nothing is if there was nothing, which means that God didn't exist until God created something. And that something would have had to have been God. So you can see why I say God exists and doesn't exist. You can already start to see like why I would say that. So let's say God created something. He had to create out of himself. So the moment, think about how a cell in a body creates. It doesn't just pop a new cell out of nothing. It divides itself. So the way God creates, I'm saying from a common sense, logical point, okay? I can't, if you want to play totally irrational, totally illogical games of like, well, I think, God just creates stuff and God still is exactly the same as he was and he just created something else and it didn't diminish God at all. It just created something new. Well, that's not rational. That's not logical. And that would be like saying God created something out of nothing. And you say, well, God did. It says it in the Bible. And people say it and I believe it. I understand that. So if you're one of those people who just wants to believe what you believe and never change it and that's just the way it is, which I'm saying to you, if you really explore your beliefs, will lead you to making excuses to creating a world that's best for all. So if you want to create a world that's best for all, you have to consider these points. Otherwise, you will use it as an excuse. And if you don't, then I really want you to, I don't know if you want to argue with me, but argue with yourself. Why should I change the system? Why should I change the system to be best for all? And if you have any excuse about it, then you should probably start looking into what you actually believe about God. So, in the beginning, God created something. And that something he created out of himself. So now God, by separating himself into something, into what's remaining and something new, God is less than he was before. As an individual. Maybe in total, that God has not changed. The amount of God, the amount of things that exist, not things as in individuals, but the amount of substance that exists has not changed. It's simply divided in two. And now you have two beings. You have two things. Because God can't just create something arbitrarily synthetic that's not alive. If God splits itself into some piece, that piece is also God. That piece is also alive. That piece is also everything that God is. So now you have two things. And it doesn't, you say like, well, one's bigger than the other one. What does that even mean? How can God create something smaller than itself? That would still be limiting. It could only be something that's perfectly equal to God. But there's a new thing that's been introduced, which is the concept of two things. So now you have two equal gods. And you might say, well, what's the problem with that? They're both equally the most powerful being that exists. Well, you can't be the most powerful being if there's two things. They have to both equally be powerful. So they have to be equally, as individuals rather, be less powerful than the one God was before, although together, as two, as one unit, they could be as equally as powerful as the one was before. But with one caveat. They now have to agree with each other on what they want to do, what they want to create. Because if they don't, then they don't have the combined power that they had before as one. They only have the power individually as themselves as half of what they were before. Look, if you want to play logic games of like, well, I think God can just make stuff and he's still all powerful, and then just, if you want to continue to be retarded, then be retarded. But again, if you want to actually consider things as a mature, rational person with common sense to get to solutions in this world, then consider what I'm saying. So now you have two equal gods. Now they have to agree. And if they don't agree, if one says, well, I still want to be the all-powerful, you have to submit to me and do what I say, that's not going to work. And if they keep dividing again, eventually you have 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, 512, or is that right? No, 256. You know what I'm saying? Keep going, right? And they just get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller to the point where, geez, they probably don't even remember anymore what it was like to be that one God. And now you start getting groups and collectives fighting with each other and trying to dominate other groups. And you get basically what we have today. So my basic point is God still exists. God exists. Remember, God doesn't exist. God does exist. Why doesn't God exist? Because that God that is that all-powerful singular being no longer exists. It can't by definition. It has to no longer exist for there to be anything other than just that one singular God. There has to be not that God anymore. And now, God still exists because if you take each piece as a whole, acting as one and acting as equals, and why do I say equals? Because if let's say there's 1 million individuals that God has broken itself up into. If each of those individuals are not equally valued by each other, then those individuals acting together as one, which would be the only way to access that one power, creative, highest being creativeness that God originally had, the only way for them to utilize that power would be acting as one. But if they don't see each other as equally valuable, then that one, the power of that one would be wielded in a way that it would harm at least one of the individuals, because they're not seen as equal. So if the decisions of that collective group are not made in a way where each one is valued equally, according to the form that each individual is now in, so equal doesn't mean treat exactly the same. It just means if you have a tomato plant and you have a watermelon plant and you have a pepper plant or something, they need different amounts of sunlight, they need different amounts of water and so forth, right? But you don't say, well, my pepper plants are more important, so I'm just going to give them all the water and not give enough water to the tomato plant. So equal, no, they're all equally valuable. I need to figure out what their each individual needs are, and I care about them all equally. So I'm going to do what's best for each of them in their specific context. But it's because you have equal value placed on each one. The moment you say one's more important in the context of this individual units acting as one as God, you're going to create consequences that are going to affect at least one, which is then going to revolt and say, hey, I'm getting the fucking raw end of this deal. And then it's not going to allow its one little piece to be wielded as the one collective power. And now even the 99% against the one doesn't have the power it had anymore. So there is no more all-powerful being. No, it's just not an option anymore. So now you have all these problems that may only be able to be solved by that one all-powerful being, but can't be, because you don't have agreement from all different parts of reality that, hey, yes, I give my consent to solving this problem in this way. That, yes, you can wield this ultimate power. Because you've now harmed one of them, and they're basically saying, fuck you. I withdraw. You can have 99% of your power, but you can't have 100%. And that means there will be certain problems that won't be able to be solved. There will be consequences. That is the world we live in right now. So, there is God, and there isn't. The God that is the one higher power, highest power, all-powerful being that takes all responsibility for everything as one being does not any longer exist. It cannot exist. It's not possible for it to exist naturally, logically. The only way for it to exist as an individual is when all of the smaller, let's say, constituent individual parts act as one, recognizing themselves all equally as that original one and working together. So it's not to say that that God cannot exist. It is just something that can't exist as an individual being, all-powerful, because it's like if you have a body, a human body, it is one individual being. But when it's sick, it's not at its full potential. When it's diseased. And the only reason it's diseased is because some of the cells in that body, something's not right with them. They're inflamed, there's a problem, there's cancer, there's whatever, and that body, it's not able to act as its full potential. It's still there, it's just not in its full potential because each of the cells are not acting, or not in their full potential point. So this is the real point I want to share with everybody is, I'm speaking for myself, I am not against God. I'm against anyone using anything as an excuse to not change the system to be best for all. And it's not just the concept of God that people use. It's also their own personal beliefs about other things. It's their own fears. It's self-interest. And if you really think about it, when you boil it down, wanting there to be a highest power, supreme being, God, is the ultimate expression of self-interest. When you don't recognize the equality of all and create a system that is best for all. So, which would be the definition of only pure self-interest. Self-interest combined with the recognition of equality, where then you have the understanding the interest of all equally as self, which is just what we call best for all. That is the key. That's the point of the destiny process, is to do the self-forgiveness. Instead of projecting the power of forgiveness only on God, you project it, you take responsibility rather, and you say, the things that I'm accepting and allowing that are not best, as patterns within myself, fears, limitations, whatever, I have to take the responsibility of forgiving those points for myself. Whether you want forgiveness from God for certain things is a separate point. You have to take the responsibility because you have free will. And that is the ultimate point of you supporting the existence of an actual real God that would take responsibility for everything, is you take responsibility for yourself equally as an individual, and directing yourself and supporting others to create a system that is best for all. Because that is ultimately what you're looking for from God, is that you go to heaven or you go to some other state, or maybe God does it on earth, but ultimately God creates like a heaven-like experience for those who believe. But that's actually a self-interested thing. You're actually just looking out for yourself, of wanting to be one of those ones to have that experience. But you have to be willing to give it. You have to be willing to create it. You have to be willing to stand for it, to stand behind it, to stand as it. And it's not easy. But that is the whole purpose of us being here in existence and on this earth, is to walk that process and to stand together as a group.